boy appears from the blazing prairie, dragging a travois behind him, and on it the lifeless body of his sister. With one heartbreaking request, he shatters a lonely rancher's world. "Sir, can you bury her?" What follows is a story of sorrow survival, and a bond that redefines the meaning of family. Stay with us. This tale may just change how you see love loss and the legacy we leave behind. The sky that summer looked more like a kiln than a canvas. It burned without mercy over the great sand dunes of Colorado, casting down a sun so fierce it bleached bone and blistered earth. Grass had long since given up the fight, curling into brittle yellow husks. The wind didn't cool, didn't carry hope. It only lifted dust into the eyes of anyone fool enough to walk the land in daylight. Samuel Prescott wasn't a fool, but he was a man with nothing left to lose. It had been 5 years since he buried his wife Elizabeth under a cottonwood tree behind the house they'd built together. The tree was the only thing that still bloomed on his ranch. Samuel talked to it sometimes, not because he believed she heard, but because it was the only place his voice didn't echo with loneliness. The ranch had once been alive, cattle lowing at dawn, chickens raising a racket in the coop, laughter over supper. All of that had been traded for silence and the dry grind of chores. Samuel stayed because he didn't know what else to do. His hands remembered how to build, fence, fix a saddle patch, a roof. His heart remembered Elizabeth. That was enough, until the day he saw the boy. It was a Thursday, mid-morning. Samuel was out along the eastern perimeter wrestling with a warped fence post that refused to stand straight. The sweat from his brow had already dried twice over. He straightened his back, reached for his canteen, and froze. Something was moving across the horizon. At first, he thought it was the heat playing tricks mirages were common out here, bending the air until the world looked like it was made of water. But this wasn't a ripple. It was a shadow. 2 of them, low to the ground, sluggish. He narrowed his eyes, squinting past the waves of heat. A child, maybe, no, 2 shapes, one trailing behind the other. Too slow for animals, too small for adults. Samuel dropped his tools. The wire cutter hit the ground with a clank as he stepped forward, boots crunching over sun-split earth. His heart thumped in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years, a mixture of dread and something else he couldn't name. When the figures finally resolved into view, he saw a boy no more than 10 dragging a makeshift travois fashioned from 2 branches and some frayed cloth. On it lay a second child, a girl limp and still. The boy's face was hollow eyes, pale, and dry lips cracked and bleeding. His clothes hung off his frame like they didn't belong to him. Samuel didn't call out, didn't wave. He just walked. The boy stopped when Samuel was about 20 feet away. He let the travois drop with a puff of dust and stood there trembling. But his eyes didn't waver. He looked straight at Samuel with a gaze so solemn and heavy it knocked the breath from his lungs. "Sir," the boy said. The word came out thin and broken. "Can you bury my sister?" That was the moment something cracked open inside Samuel Prescott. He'd heard many things in his life: cattle dying, wind howling through empty barns, Elizabeth's final breath. But nothing had ever sounded like that. He didn't speak right away, just stared at the little girl, her face gray and waxy, her hands folded across her chest like someone had taught her how to rest in death. Then he looked back at the boy. His legs were shaking, not from fear, from sheer exhaustion. "What's your name, son?" Samuel asked finally. Eli Morgan." "All right, Eli," he said, voice gentler now. "Come on, let's get you both out of this sun." The boy didn't protest. He simply nodded, bent down, and picked up the rope tied to the travois. Samuel stepped forward. "I'll carry her." Eli let go. She weighed almost nothing, less than a sack of grain. Samuel had lifted calves heavier than this, but as he cradled her in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder, the weight of her pressed on him in a way no bale or beam ever had. They walked in silence back to the house. The wind whispered over the plains, as if even it had grown tired of speaking. Inside, Samuel laid the girl on the spare bed Elizabeth's sister used to sleep in. He fetched water bread and broth for Eli, who ate with the hesitant urgency of someone who hadn't tasted food in days. When the boy's thirst had eased enough for his voice to return, Samuel learned the rest. Their father had been shot near Taos by claim jumpers who wanted his land. Their mother died, giving birth to a baby brother who never lived long enough to be named. Eli had tried to care for his sister Mary as her fever worsened. He used what he had: berries, dirty creek water, hope. Hope failed. She was scared, Eli whispered later that night sitting on the porch beside Samuel as the stars blinked slowly into the sky. She kept asking for Mama. I told her everything would be all right, but I didn't know how to fix it. Samuel looked at the boy's profile, so young, yet carved by loss like a man 3 times his age. The sunset painted his face in gold and purple, but nothing could soften the shadows under his eyes. "You did what you could," Samuel said. "You stayed. That means something." Eli didn't answer, but he didn't cry either. That somehow hurt more. The next morning, before the sun rose too high, Samuel dug a grave beside Elizabeth's. The soil was hard-dry, reluctant. Each shovelful felt like tearing open a wound that refused to bleed. Eli stood nearby, holding wildflowers he'd found at dawn, scraggly but bright. When the hole was finished, Samuel placed Mary into the small wooden box he'd kept in the barn for years, a leftover from a time when disease came in waves and grief was measured by how many were left standing. He wrapped her in white linen, kissed her forehead, and closed the lid. They lowered her together, Eli gripping one side of the rope with silent reverence. Afterward, they stood quietly. No long eulogies, no preacher, just a child, a man, and the sky. "You're not alone anymore." Samuel said, his voice rough. Eli looked up at him, not with hope, not yet, but with the kind of understanding that only comes to those who have seen the edge and stepped back from it. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the beginning. The beginning of something neither had dared to imagine was still possible. A second chance. Before dawn broke, the next day the air was still. The kind of stillness that comes only after sorrow has soaked the ground. Samuel Prescott stood beneath the cottonwood tree behind his house shovel in hand, staring at the patch of earth he had chosen the night before. The same tree under which he had buried Elizabeth now stretched its roots to make room for another soul. Eli hadn't spoken much since the night before. The boy had curled up near the kitchen hearth, not asking for a blanket, not requesting more food. He just lay there with his back to the fire, knees drawn in, as if trying to keep what was left of his sister close. Samuel hadn't slept either. He sat in the chair where Elizabeth used to read, staring at the flames and trying to understand what fate had just placed on his porch. The grave didn't dig easily. The earth was as stubborn as Samuel remembered. Every swing of the shovel was like a conversation with the past, every thud echoing with a grief that had never quite left him. He remembered digging Elizabeth's grave. He remembered the taste of salt on his lips, whether it was sweat or tears he could no longer say. Now, here he was digging again, for a child who wasn't his, for a girl whose name he had only learned hours ago. Eli came out just as the sun peeked over the dunes, carrying a small bunch of wildflowers. He didn't speak, just stood beside Samuel and waited. There was no need to explain why he was there. Some bonds are forged not in words, but in silence shared beside a wound too deep for speech. Samuel had a small pine box in the barn. It had been built long ago, back when a wave of fever had passed through the county, and he thought perhaps he might need it. It had sat gathering dust until now. He cleaned it the night before, lined it with the softest cloth he could find, an old linen tablecloth Elizabeth had embroidered but never used. They laid Mary inside together. Eli placed a faded ribbon in her hands, one she used to wear in her hair, he said. Samuel added a small wooden cross, hand-carved with initials he burned carefully into the grain. As they lowered the box into the ground, the morning air carried not a single sound. No birdsong, no wind. Just the hush of two souls bearing witness to the final rest of a third. Samuel spoke first, voice low and measured. "Lord, you know this child better than we do. You know her laughter, her fears, her dreams. Take her gently, let her rest, and let her brother find peace." Eli didn't cry. He simply whispered, "She liked flowers," and began placing each of his wild blooms around the grave in neat little clusters. Prairie bluebells, Indian paintbrush, a sprig of sage. He adjusted each one like it mattered more than anything. When the grave was filled, they stood side by side for a long while. Samuel finally placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "I don't have much, son, but what I do have is yours for now. You don't have to walk another mile unless you want to, and you don't have to say goodbye to her alone." Eli nodded, and for the first time the boy leaned into him. Not fully, not all at once, but just enough for Samuel to feel the weight of trust begin to shift. The day moved on, but slowly. Samuel gave Eli his own tin cup for water, his own plate at the table. He brought out clean clothes, a shirt from when he was younger and leaner, some pants that would need hemming. Eli accepted them with a quiet thank you and disappeared into the back room to change. That evening, Samuel found him sitting on the edge of the porch, staring into the last light of the day. He sat beside him, neither one speaking at first. The silence between them had started to take on a different tone, less of a wall, more of a bridge. Eli turned his head slightly. "Do you think she's mad at me that I didn't save her?" Samuel closed his eyes for a second. "No, son. She knew you tried, and I believe she's proud of you. She held on as long as she did because you were there." The boy nodded slowly, absorbing it like the land drank rain. Later that night, after Eli had gone to bed, Samuel sat by the fire and looked around his house. It had never felt lonelier than when Elizabeth died. But now it felt different. There were footsteps upstairs, a small cup on the sink, a ribbon left on the windowsill. Traces of life again. He didn't know where this road was headed, but he did know one thing. The boy had come to him asking for help to bury a sister. What Samuel had found was something else entirely. The beginning of a promise he didn't know he'd been waiting to make, and he intended to keep it. The third morning came with a hush that felt different. Not the silence of grief, but something more hesitant, like the prairie itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside the house, the fire had long gone cold, but warmth lingered not from heat but from presence. Samuel Prescott stood at the stove brewing coffee as the scent of earth and wood smoke mingled in the stillness. It had been years since he'd made 2 cups. Eli came downstairs barefoot, his 2 large pants cuffed awkwardly above his ankles. His hair stuck out in every direction, sleep clinging to his young face, but his eyes, those same haunted eyes, looked clearer, not whole, not yet, but less lost. Samuel slid a plate of warm cornbread and scrambled eggs across the table. Eli ate in silence, but this time his appetite had returned. They didn't talk about Mary that morning. They didn't need to. Some grief carves so deep that words only skim the surface. But Samuel noticed how Eli sat a little straighter, how his hands didn't tremble when he reached for the butter. Later, Samuel took the boy on a slow ride out to the north pasture. The trail was gentle, the sun not yet high enough to scorch. He gave Eli the reins of an old, mild-tempered mare named Rose. The boy's legs barely reached halfway down her sides, but his grip was firm and his back was steady. "Have you ever ridden?" before Samuel asked. Eli nodded. "Pa taught me on a mule back in Missouri. She was mean." Samuel chuckled. "Well, Rose ain't. Just don't sing around her. She hates it." That earned a small smile, barely a flicker, but it was there. And in that smile was something Samuel hadn't seen in a long time, the beginning of return, of breath after holding too much sorrow for too long. They spent the afternoon mending a section of fence. Samuel showed Eli how to pull wire tight without snapping it, how to set a post with true weight behind the hammer, how to check the earth for signs of drought stress. Eli watched, mimicked, asked smart questions. He learned not just with his eyes, but with the urgency of someone who knew survival wasn't given, it was earned. By the end of the day, Eli's hands were blistered, his shoulders sore. But he didn't complain. Instead, he stood beside Samuel, sweat streaking the dirt on his face, and said, "I like working. It feels like I'm doing something real." That night, they ate stew on the porch knees, bumping in the dark as crickets filled the air. Eli asked about the stars, and Samuel pointed out constellations. He told stories about ranchers who'd come and gone about the time Elizabeth tried to raise peacocks and nearly burned down the chicken coop. Eli laughed. Not a big laugh, but a true one. Each day, after the routines grew. Morning chores, breakfast a ride out to check the herd. Samuel taught Eli how to read the sky, how to spot the difference between a heat mirage and a dust devil. They worked the garden in the cool of evening, picking squash and beans, watering the stubborn tomato plants that Elizabeth had once begged to grow. One day, Eli knelt beside a bed of onions, his fingers gentle in the dirt. "She liked onions," he said quietly. "Used to fry them with potatoes when we had 'em." Samuel didn't reply. He just handed the boy a basket and helped him fill it. At night, they sat with books. Samuel dusted off old readers Elizabeth used in her teaching days, dog-eared pages, notes in the margins. Eli struggled at first, but his determination was sharp. He read aloud with a slow cadence, his brow furrowed, his lips moving before sound came out. By the end of the week, he was reading short passages on his own. "Do you think I could learn to write like that?" he asked, pointing to a passage from a story about a boy and his dog. "You can learn to do anything if you stick with it," Samuel answered. Eli didn't smile, but his fingers traced the words as if they were keys to a door he hadn't dared open until now. Some nights the dreams came. Samuel could hear the boy whimpering through the walls, whispers, for his mother, sobs that he tried to muffle with his pillow. Samuel didn't go in, didn't force comfort. Instead, he left the bedroom door, cracked a small lantern lit on the hallway floor. One morning, he found Eli curled on the rug outside his own room, too afraid to sleep alone, too proud to ask. So he moved the cot into the guest room, not to take over the bed, but to be near it. The boy wasn't ready to lie in softness just yet. Comfort had to be earned too. The real shift came the day Samuel trusted Eli with the herd. Just a few cows, older ones who'd stray if not nudged. He gave Eli the task of leading them to the lower paddock. When Eli returned dusty but triumphant, Samuel offered him the best praise he knew. "Good work. You're starting to think like a rancher." Eli blinked, then looked away, his jaw tight with unspoken emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. That evening, as they sat watching the sun melt into the hills, Eli spoke without prompting. "She was scared, you know. Mary." At the end, "She kept asking if I thought Mama would come back for us." Samuel waited. Let the boy find his own rhythm. "I told her yes. Even though I knew she wouldn't, I didn't want her to feel alone." "You did right," Samuel said. Eli nodded slowly, then added, "I think maybe you came instead." Samuel didn't know what to say to that, so he just placed his hand over the boys, let it rest there as the night deepened around them. The house, once so silent, now breathed. Not loudly, not confidently, but it breathed through shared work, through quiet meals, through the gentle rhythm of recovery. Eli hadn't been saved. He was still learning, still scarred. But so was Samuel, and together they were learning to breathe again. It was the kind of morning that seemed too quiet to trust. The wind didn't stir, the cattle were still. Even the old rooster who usually crowed before dawn like it was his sworn duty stayed silent. Something was shifting not in the land but in the air between two people who'd been orbiting each other like wary travelers. Samuel Prescott knew that kind of quiet. He'd felt it once before, the day Elizabeth told him she was with child, the promise of a new beginning, hidden inside silence. Eli had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months now. What had started as a fragile truce had become something deeper, more rooted. The boy no longer hovered at the edges of the porch like a shadow. He walked with purpose. He took initiative. He even had opinions now about how best to corral the heifers, which tools needed sharpening, and how the north pasture needed reseeding before fall. Samuel had begun calling him son without realizing it. At first, it slipped out like a habit from a life he never had, but Eli didn't flinch. He didn't correct him. He just nodded, like maybe it felt right on his shoulders too. One afternoon, as the two sat beneath the cottonwood tree that shaded Mary's grave, Samuel cleared his throat. "You ever think about going to Santa Fe to find your Uncle Eli didn't answer right away?" He plucked at a blade of grass, rolled it between his fingers. "He's blood," he said finally, "but he's never written, never came. He don't feel like family." Samuel looked at the boy, still thin, but filling out his shoulders, broader his skin, more sun-warmed than sunburned now. There was grit in him, strength. But what startled Samuel most was the tenderness that hadn't dyed the part that hadn't hardened after all he'd seen. "I don't want to leave," Eli added. "Not unless you want me gone." The words hit Samuel like a blow he hadn't braced for. He reached for his coffee, trying to steady his voice. "No, son. I don't want that. Not now, not ever." A week later, they rode into town and found Judge Harmon, a man Samuel had known since he first homesteaded this land. The paperwork was surprisingly straightforward. Nobody contested, nobody even questioned it. Frontier life made room for what mattered, and what mattered was this. A man who had no child and a boy who had no father had somehow found their way to each other. When the judge asked if Eli wanted to take Samuel's name, the boy didn't hesitate. "Eli Prescott," he said softly, as if trying it on like a coat he hoped would finally fit. They celebrated with root beer and beef stew at the town's small diner. On the ride home, Eli was quiet, but he kept glancing at Samuel like he couldn't quite believe the day had gone the way it had. Back at the ranch, changes came naturally. Samuel let Eli take charge of the south fence line rebuild. He gave him his own saddle, had his name carved into the leather. Eli, in turn, brought life back into places that had grown dusty with time. He reorganized the barn, started composting scraps for the garden, and even painted the chicken coop a cheerful shade of blue. But it wasn't the work that made Samuel sure. It was the little things. The way Eli hung his hat on the same peg Elizabeth used to. How he helped the neighbor's child fix a broken wagon wheel without being asked. How he placed a wildflower beside Mary's grave each Sunday without fail. One evening they sat on the porch watching lightning flicker far off in the distance. "Do you think she would have liked me?" Eli asked suddenly. Samuel didn't need to ask who he meant. "Elizabeth," he said. "She would have loved you, not just liked, she always wanted a child. But it never happened. She would have spoiled you rotten and taught you how to make buttermilk biscuits that actually rose. Eli gave a crooked smile, and Samuel saw it. Then the softness returning to a face that had been all bone and burden. I used to think being wanted was something you had to earn, Eli said. Like if I worked hard enough, didn't complain, maybe someone would keep me. Samuel shook his head slowly. Being wanted isn't a prize, son. It's a truth. You're wanted because you're you, not because you fix fences or feed chickens. The words lingered in the air, quiet but undeniable. That night Samuel heard footsteps in the hall, then the soft creak of the stairs. He opened his door to find Eli standing there sheepish. "Could I sleep in your room tonight?" "Just for a bit," Samuel nodded. "Course." The boy curled up on the old rug near the fire. Didn't say much, but before falling asleep he whispered, "Thanks, Pa." Samuel sat in his chair watching the embers, heart full in a way it hadn't been since the last time Elizabeth had smiled at him across this very room. It struck him then what had started as an act of kindness, a moment of mercy on a dry summer day, had turned into something sacred. He hadn't just taken in a boy. He'd found a son. 10 years passed, just like that. The land hadn't changed much, the same stretch of dry, stubborn prairie outside Alamosa, the same sun-bleached fences, the same wind that whispered at night like it knew your secrets. But within the walls of the Prescott Ranch, everything had changed, because what once had been a house full of ghosts had become a home filled with life. Samuel Prescott sat in the same creaky chair on the front porch, a blanket draped over his knees, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He watched as Eli saddled a mare in the distance, one hand steady on the reins, the other brushing dust from the saddle like a man born to the rhythm of ranching. Eli moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every ounce of peace now resting in his bones. He was no longer a boy. He was a man, a good one. The early light struck Eli's shoulders as he guided a group of young ranch hands out toward the grazing fields. They followed without question. That's the kind of man he'd become. Not loud, not boastful. Just solid, reliable, and kind. The kind of man folks listened to because he spoke the truth and lived it even when no one was looking. Samuel smiled not because of pride, but because of gratitude. Gratitude for a second chance, not just for Eli, but for himself. Eli and his wife, Clara, lived in the new house just beyond the old barn now. She was a schoolteacher from Colorado Springs, sharp as a tack and sweet as molasses. The kind of woman Elizabeth would have adored. They were expecting their first child come autumn, and already the ranch had begun to buzz with preparation. Clara's laughter filled the kitchen like sunshine. Eli had built a cradle with his own hands, shaping each joint with the same care Samuel had once taught him to fix a fence. Most evenings after supper they all sat on the porch, Clara with her needlework, Eli with a ledger or a rope to mend, and Samuel just watching. Sometimes he read aloud, sometimes he just listened, and sometimes he let himself feel the weight of all that had come before. Not as a burden anymore, but as something sacred. Each year, on the anniversary of Mary's passing, Eli took his wife and later his young son to the tree where she was buried. The grave was never overgrown, never forgotten. Eli would kneel down, brush away the leaves, and tell Mary about his life, about his home, about the baby on the way, about the family they were building together. It was a ritual, not of mourning, but of memory of keeping something beautiful alive through time. Samuel often watched from a distance, letting Eli have those moments. But sometimes when no one else was around, he'd sit by the grave, tip his hat, and whisper, "Thank you." Because it had been Mary, her presence, her loss, her memory, that had brought Eli to his doorstep that blistering day so long ago. Her death had broken something, yes, but it had also planted a seed. Now that seed had grown. The Prescott Ranch, once a modest operation, was now one of the most respected spreads in 3 counties. Not because of size or profit, but because of the people who ran it. Folks said the land seemed to bloom under Eli's watch. Calves were stronger. Fields held rain longer. Neighbors helped each other more. The ranch had become more than a home, it was a haven, and Samuel. He had become what he never dared to believe he could be again, part of a family. One cold evening in early winter, as the fire crackled low and snow whispered against the window panes, Eli knelt beside his father's chair, holding a letter from the county office. "It's official," he said, eyes gleaming. "We're certified to foster. Clara and I want to open the ranch to children like I was, lost, alone, maybe scared, but not for long." Samuel's breath caught, not because of surprise, but because he saw it now how the legacy would live on, not in name or cattle, but in compassion. He took Eli's hand in his, their calloused fingers gripping tight. "You're doing good, son. Better than I ever dreamed." Eli shook his head. "No, Pa. I'm just passing on what you gave me." That night, Samuel slept deeper than he had in years. The next morning, as dawn crept over the horizon and the wind swept softly across the fields, Samuel rose before anyone else. He walked slowly out to the cottonwood tree. The air was crisp, and the earth beneath his boots held the chill of coming frost. He stood beside Mary's grave, brushed away the fallen leaves, and whispered, "She's safe now. He's safe, and I am too." He turned back toward the house where firelight flickered in the windows and laughter waited just inside. The ranch was quiet again, but this time it was a peaceful quiet. The kind born of work, well done of love, shared freely of pain, turned gently into purpose. Some folks still say that the boy who arrived dragging his sister's body behind him didn't survive that prairie, that he died there under the weight of sorrow too heavy for a child to carry. But Samuel knew better. The boy didn't die. He transformed. Eli Henderson became Eli Prescott, not through papers or courtrooms, but through love, through days spent mending fences and nights spent learning to hope again. He wasn't rescued. He was nurtured. He wasn't changed. He was allowed to grow. And as Samuel watched Eli in the distance, leading another group of foster kids toward the corral, he felt a warmth so deep it nearly knocked the breath out of him. Legacy, he realized, wasn't what you left behind when you died. It was what you planted while you lived. And this family, this ranch, this life, it was the garden he never expected to grow, blooming right there in the dust. Eli's journey wasn't just a tale of sorrow and survival. It was a quiet testament to the power of unexpected love, resilience, and the kind of hope that refuses to die. When a boy emerged from the blistering heat of the Colorado prairie, dragging a travois, carrying his lifeless sister, he didn't just ask for help. He unknowingly offered a broken man a chance to live again. Samuel Prescott once resigned to silence, and solitude opened his door and found something he didn't know he'd been searching for, a reason to begin again. That moment, the boy's plea. The man's quiet nod wasn't just a meeting of strangers. It was the birth of a bond, not forged in blood, but in suffering compassion and the shared will to keep going. What followed was not a grand, sweeping transformation, but a slow unfolding. Day by day, the ranch that had once been nothing more than a relic of Samuel's grief began to breathe again, and the boy who arrived with hollow eyes and blistered feet began to stand taller, speak louder, and trust deeper. Samuel taught Eli the ways of the land, how to ride, mend, plant, and endure. But more importantly, he taught him that a person's worth wasn't measured in strength alone, but in kindness, integrity, and consistency. Eli, in return, reminded Samuel how to laugh, how to feel, how to hope. Their days were simple fence repairs, garden rows, long rides across sun-baked fields, but they were filled with the kind of quiet depth that only comes when hearts are healing together. Eli asked questions about the stars. Samuel told stories of Elizabeth, and slowly, a house that had once echoed with absence began to echo with life. Years passed. The bond between them deepened until the line between caretaker and child guardian and ward disappeared completely. Samuel didn't just raise Eli. He became his father in every way that counted. And Eli didn't just find shelter. He built a life. When Eli married Clara and welcomed his own child into the world, the circle widened, not ended. The Prescott Ranch flourished not only as a home for cattle, but as a refuge for others like Eli once was. Lost children, wandering hearts. Samuel's legacy wasn't in the cattle brands or the property deeds. It lived in the laughter that now spilled from the porch, in the cradle built with weathered hands, in the graves tended with flowers and quiet prayers. Each spring, Eli took his family to visit Mary's grave. He would kneel, brush away the leaves, and share his life with her, the trials, the joys, the quiet victories. He told her about the orchard they planted the children they were raising, the love that grew strong beneath the same roof that once sheltered them both. This story is a reminder that love doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks out of the dust, asks to bury the dead, and stays to raise the living. It reminds us that we are not limited by the pain we carry, but shaped by how we choose to respond to it. That healing is not a destination but a way of walking forward, one step, one gesture, one shared moment at a time. In today's world, where so many feel isolated and adrift, the story of Eli and Samuel offers something profoundly grounding. It says, you matter. You can begin again. And even if life has taken everything, it can still offer something back, often in the most unexpected form. So what lesson do we carry with us? That legacy is not built in the loud chapters of our lives, but in the quiet ones. In the decision to say yes when it's easier to turn away. In the act of planting love where only loss once lived. In the commitment to nurture what others might overlook. This is what Samuel did for Eli, and this is what Eli continues to do for others. Their story teaches us that family is not defined by birth, but by action, that the roots we plant in others can grow far beyond what we imagine, and that a single act of compassion, a door opened, a child embraced, can ripple through generations. If this story has touched your heart, if it stirred something deep within you, a memory, a hope, a quiet ache, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel. Help us bring more of these powerful stories to light. Stories that remind us of who we are, what we can endure, and how we can rise not just for ourselves, but for one another. Because somewhere out there, someone is still walking through the dust, and maybe, just maybe your heart is the home they've been looking for.